This is the French Revolution by Micah McLean. Prior to the French Revolution, France was organized under the old regime. Basically, it was feudalism. Everyone was split into three different estates: the clergy, the nobles, the peasants, with the king being on top, of course. The king had all the power, and the clergy and the nobles were exempt from most of the taxes. This left the poorest estate, the third estate, to pay for literally everything. France was in a ton of debt from wars, like supporting the American Revolution and building the Palace of Versailles. Multiple successive kings had drained the royal treasury. France was near bankruptcy with zero money. This made the taxes rise once again, and the third estate had to pay even more. They went to paying a lot to even more than a lot. So in 1789, King Louis called the Estates General to see if he could increase the taxes yet again. He needed more money, so he decided, hey, I'll just call these Estate General dudes and raise the price again for everything. Now, the Estates General had not been called for over 150 years. The Third Estate was naturally very excited about this. They got a say in what the government did, and during this time, philosophers were going around spreading ideas about brotherhood, freedom, and equality. So the Third Estate was thinking that they might be able to get some of those rights in their discussion for the Estates General meetings. Each estate had only one vote, which the Third Estate did not like. They made the majority of the French population. The Third Estate eventually got so dissatisfied that they declared themselves the National Assembly and started running things on their own. The king didn't like this, so he decided to lock them out of the place they were meeting. The National Assembly then decided to go to an indoor tennis court, where they were joined by most of the clergy and a couple nobles. There they took the tennis court oath, which basically said that they're not going to disband until they get a constitution and get rights and equal taxation and all that fun stuff. The king refused to listen to the National Assembly and threatened to send them home. During this time, mercenaries were arriving at Paris, and the king fired a man named Jacques Necker, who was his financial advisor. He was very popular with the Third Estate, and the king fired him for publishing a false report. Now, the National Assembly took this as a threat against them. These events led to the people of Paris rioting and storming the Bastille on July 14th. The Bastille is kind of a giant fortress prison type deal, which had only 7 prisoners in it. But the main reason they attacked the Bastille was to get weapons and gunpowder, and to overthrow a symbol of the old regime and the king. So they stormed the Bastille, they got all their weapons. 3 days later, the king was forced to accept the new National Assembly as the governing body of France. The king went from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy where he had very little power, and on August 4th, the National Assembly got rid of feudalism, and on August 26th published the Declaration of Rights of Man and of Citizen, which promised things like equality, liberty, brotherhood. All men are equal before the law, there's no special courts, no special privileges, everyone's taxed equal, stuff like that, which is basically everything everybody wanted at the time. During this time, you start to see 2 major political groups start to emerge, the Girondins and the Jacobins. The Girondins were more conservative and wanted to keep a constitutional monarchy, which is what they had right now. The Jacobins were more of the radical group, and they wanted to abolish the monarchy and set up a republic. Ideas of freedom and of a republic caused some peasants in the nation to revolt against their landowners, who were wealthy noblemen, causing them to flee or be killed. This is the start of the Great Fear, where many nobles became emigres, which is basically a person who leaves their country for fear of their life. The Great Fear lasted most of the French Revolution. On October 5th, 1798, a bunch of women were rioting over the high price of bread, which just raised from nearly unpayable to definitely not payable. And they eventually grew numerous enough to storm the city's armory and get weapons, and then they went up to the Palace of Versailles, which is where the king and the royal family were all residing, and they demanded that the king come back to Paris, which he did, and he ordered his guards not to fire into the crowds. In June of 1791, the royal family tried to escape France to lead a counter-revolutions that would restore him to power. They were stopped at a town called Varennes, and there they were arrested. This is the point where the king lost much public support, and he was confined to the Tuileries Palace. There were numerous protests during this whole affair, and during one of these protests, the National Guards, which was the army of the National Assembly basically, The National Guard fired into the crowd, killing between 13 and 50 people. Historians just can't get an idea of how many people were killed. First part of the revolution, where French people killed other French people in the name of the revolution. So, the National Assembly decided to change its name, because why not? Name changes are fun. So they switched their name to the Legislative Assembly on September 30th, 1791. On August 10th, 1792, militians stormed the king's palace and took the king hostage, killing his guards, who were Swedish. They then took the king to the Legislative Assembly, who then voted to suspend the monarchy. They were able to do this because only 1/3 of the Legislative Assembly was actually in session, and the majority of those 1/3 were Jacobins who did not want the monarchy. This then led to the September massacres, in which the National Guard killed prisoners thought to be traitors. This was mostly spurred on by the Jacobins, who wanted to kill all anti-revolutionary people. And most of the people who were killed were actually priests who refused to swear an oath to the Constitution and to the new nation. Yeah, the priests were required to swear an oath to the nation so as to show their loyalty and that they wouldn't betray the nation. Most of the priests refused to swear this oath, and yeah, this kind of started the Jacobins trying to kill them every chance they got. On September 20th, the Legislative Assembly got bored of being called the Legislative Assembly, so they decided to call themselves the National Convention, abolished the monarchy completely, and declared a republic. This marks the end of the September massacres, where they all kind of agreed to stop killing people. For the time being, of course. So eventually war erupted due to rising tensions between all the countries, and France was kind of starting to lose money again. So France declared a preemptive war on Austria on the 20th of April, 1792. Prussia joined the Austrian side a few weeks later. So the French army suffered many defeats by the Prussians. They were not prepared, apparently. But once the Prussians hit Valmy, they were decimated by the French army. The French army really stepped up their game there, with the Prussians being so close to the center of France. So after they defeated the Prussians at Valmy on September 20th, they pushed back, which led to French armies eventually taking over the Rhineland and most of the Austrian Netherlands. This is known as the War of the First Coalition. During this time where the French army was fighting over all this land and territory and money, the Jacobins demanded that the king be tried for treason, and they were opposed by the Girondins, who wanted the king still alive. There were more to Girondins, so the king lived and was not tried for treason. Up until they found letters about counter-revolutionary ideas and plots to end the revolution between King Louis XVI and other monarchs of surrounding countries. So then, after that, King Louis XVI was tried for treason and found guilty. He was then executed by guillotine, which is a giant wooden structure with an axe embedded in the top that can slide down, and with a flick of a switch, push of a button, however these things work, the axe blade comes crashing down on the unsuspecting neck of the victim, which then cleanly beheads the person. He was killed on January 21st, 1793. The other monarchs were shocked at this news, and France decided that it needed a bigger army, because how do you respond to angry monarchs? You make a bigger army. So the National Convention passed a law called Levy en masse, which basically is forced military conscription, which basically made the French army a whole lot bigger than any other army. And this is the first true army in Europe. It was not paid mercenary work. It was an actual people of that country banding together to fight for that country and for freedom and nationalism. This act created the largest army Europe had ever seen up to this point. So the extended wars France was in, and now having to pay even more soldiers than anyone else, this caused the French treasury to become empty again. This caused riots, and during which the Jacobins took over the government and formed a committee of public safety, headed by Robespierre, who was a very insecure man, and he saw threats everywhere. And the Committee of Public Safety was basically a committee set up to find traitors and people who would betray the revolution and kill them. So as a result, the Committee of Public Safety, headed by Robespierre, launched into something which is called the Reign of Terror, during which they killed anyone who opposed them, from Girondins to peasants to any nobles still there. They persecuted the church, and yeah, they killed a ton of people. They killed officially between 18,000 and 40,000 lives were taken by the Reign of Terror. They killed most of these people by guillotine. The Reign of Terror was not without opposition, though, and one good example of the opposition the Reign of Terror faced was the peasants at Verdi revolting. They revolted because the witch hunt against the church, which was not very nice for anyone involved, and they didn't like being conscripted into the army, which they didn't want to fight in. So the Republic forces had to get into Vendée, and they actually shut down the revolt by killing over 100,000 people. And yeah, this caused a lot of people to really hate the Committee of Public Safety and Robespierre and everything they stood for. And eventually the remaining Girondins, a lot of them were executed by Robespierre. So most of the remaining Girondins actually banded together and executed Robespierre by the same means he executed most of the people he killed. And this ended the Reign of Terror on July 27th, 1794. They then decided to establish something called the Directory, which is 5 men governing all of France, which did not work very well from various disagreements. During the time that the Directory was in control of France, a new general was showing his tactical genius. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. The French army had knocked Spain, who had joined the War of the First Coalition earlier, and Prussia out of the war, and this is a major victory for them. But Napoleon, who was at Paris during the time of royalists threatening to take over Paris and restore the monarchy, he decided to load his cannons with something called grape shot, which is basically any hard object nearby that could survive a cannon blast, and they'd stuff all those in there and shoot it out of a cannon. Basically a giant cannon shotgun. And he won the battle by shooting giant cannon shotguns into the approaching army. He was then promoted and started his first campaign in April of 1796. Under his control, the army captured Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and most of Italy. This gave France some much-needed money to provide grain and food for all the people, pay all the conscripted soldiers and all that stuff. Now, Britain, Russia, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire did not like this at all, so they decided to form what was called the Second Coalition. It's basically every single war that France fought in between the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars is called the War of the Blank Coalition. Historians are a very creative lot. So anyway, all these people formed the Second Coalition and retook most of what Napoleon had took. They even eventually trapped Napoleon over in Egypt and destroyed his fleet, and he was kind of stranded there for a little while. But he did manage to get back to France, where he performed a coup d'etat and declared himself the first consul of France, which basically is a military dictator. He even eventually declared himself Emperor of France. The War of the Second Coalition ended with the signing of the Treaty of Amiens. This is the recognized end of the French Revolution. It's a 1-year peace between all the countries of the area. So in the end of the French Revolution, France exchanged one dictator for another. They exchanged Louis XVI for Napoleon Bonaparte. The difference between Louis and Napoleon was that Napoleon did what the people wanted. He made a reformed tax system where people had to pay equal taxes, and the only exception was people who physically couldn't pay. He also separated the church and the state by a concordat, which is an agreement between the church and the state not to mess in each other's affairs, basically. And he ended the persecution of the church, which the church very much liked, and so did the peasants. He also made what was called the Napoleonic Code, which is basically a system of laws that promised equality for all men, and it granted religious freedoms and the right to choose any occupation. This was not without flaws, though, and it was not perfect, as women and children, there were no rights for them, and any rights that were there were abolished. Eventually, Napoleon was defeated and exiled to St. Helena, which is off the coast of Africa, where he died. After he got exiled, the leaders of Europe negotiated treaties to make sure that no one country could get more powerful and take over others. And if one country did start to do that, all the others were supposed to bind together to put down the rebel country. This was 100 years before World War I. So we can kind of see how successful that treaty was with the chaos that ensued in World War I, with everyone killing everyone and then Germany trying to take over all of Europe and eventually the world with the help of a few Axis powers, and we were just barely able to defeat them in both world wars. Anyway, that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I do not know if I'll be making another one.